So we can get started if you guys are ready.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, happy Mother's Day and welcome to our virtual Prairie Lights reading. I'm Karen with Prairie Lights, and today I am excited to introduce Honor Moore and Emily Bernard. We're excited to welcome Honor back to Prairie Lights today. She comes to us from her apartment in Manhattan, where she's been solo sheltering in place since March 16th, 6 days after the publication of her new book, Our Revolution, A Mother and Daughter at Midcentury. Emily comes to us from her home in South Burlington, Vermont, where she is sheltering in place with her husband, John Gennari, and their twin daughters, Julia and Isabella. She has just won the Christopher Isherwood Prize in autobiographical prose for Black is the Body, Stories from My Grandmother's Time, My Mother's Time, and Mine, just out in paperback. So I'm going to turn the virtual floor over to Honor Moore and Emily Bernard, who will each be reading 3 times from their work, and we'll have a dialogue together in between. At the end, we'll be able to open things up for questions. You'll notice at the bottom of the Zoom window that there's an icon for a Q&A. And anytime throughout the event, as you have questions, you can type them into the chat there, into the Q&A chat. And at the end, I'll sort of field questions and read them aloud. So please welcome Honor Moore and Emily Bernard.
And welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for coming. This has been such an adventure, having a book come out in the pandemic. Emily and I have been talking for days about what we're doing, and we're each going to start with a little snapshot of our mothers in college, oddly enough. My mother went to Barnard, and I guess all you need to know is that she started as a Boston Brahmin girl north of Boston, riding horses and winning blue ribbons and so on. But she ended up at Barnard. She was taking 6 courses. The most exciting was Mexican history, a Columbia graduate seminar with a professor named Frank Tannenbaum. The class was racially mixed, which was completely new to her. And now I'm going into her voice. Her voice weaves in and out of the book, this unfinished writing of hers that I inherited. So, class was racially mixed, which was completely new to her. 3 Negroes, 2 Negresses, 2 nuns, 3 priests, 6 PhDers, 7 Jews, and me. This is 1944. I am flattered to be allowed in it. For the first time, real independence, wonderful reading, and thrilling men in that history, and you go at the speed you want. Tannenbaum had been a vivid youth in his days as an anarchist. Emma Goldman described him then as coming out of the ranks of the starved and frozen humanity. Emma Goldman in My Mother's Life. Who was that dark-haired communist girl who went to that weird New York college, quipped a soldier she met one night with a Yale friend of Paul's? She was reveling in her studies. One afternoon, she got to Tannenbaum's class early and talked to one of her classmates, a Black Puerto Rican gentleman. His master's thesis was on some aspect of Shakespeare, and he invited her to see Paul Robeson in Othello, still the longest running Shakespeare ever on Broadway. He was, she wrote Paul, so bright and nice, but there was no question of her actually going to the play with him, despite how cultivated he was with his Spanish accent. Would be just my luck that some Bostonian dowager might be in town for the evening. Just a few years later, she would cringe at who she had been.
I love that. I love that piece. Well, I want to say hi to everybody. I want to thank you, Karen, for setting this up for us, in Prairie Lights. Thank you, my dear friend Honor. One of the silver linings of this pandemic has been the invitation to participate with you in this. And it's been so much fun getting to know you again and sharing this experience, writing about our mothers. There's so many interesting parallels. Our mothers came from completely different worlds in some ways. And I want to read a snapshot now. My mother also in college. And this is from a piece I published in the Yale Review. It came out in the fall winter issue. The piece is called Stereopticon. And this is my mother in college. And I think my brother is in the audience. Hi, James. And this is Mom. This was when she was in high school, but I have her right here on my desk. Our mother, very young. My mother was a protege of Robert Hayden, the first African-American poet laureate. And in this piece, I talk a little bit about that. Robert Hayden would, she would accompany Robert Hayden to readings where she would recite her own poems as an opening act. "Folks, we're watching the kettle boil," Mr. Hayden said to the crowd, admiring the young woman who would become my mother. How I treasured this story. Langston Hughes was a friend of Robert Hayden's. When he was looking for an assistant, he came to Fisk and asked Hayden to introduce him to his most promising students. On the day that my mother was scheduled to meet Hughes, she came down with a whooping cough. Hayden introduced Hughes to George Bass, who became Hughes' secretary and literary assistant right after graduation. My mother eventually went to medical school, where she and my father began their romance. It is because of this story that I became interested in Langston Hughes. It is precisely because of this story that I eventually edited a collection of letters between Hughes and his longtime friend, writer, and arts patron, Carl Van Vechten.
It's so amazing, the thing about Langston Hughes, because my mother used to read to us from Langston Hughes, The Ways of the White Folks,
I love that.
which was a collection of stories. Well,
Yeah.
these women of sort of more or less the same generation being thwarted, having a hard time getting to actually being writers. I mean, did your mother ever publish those poems?
Mom did publish. She published a poem in the Cumberland Review, and can't tell you the relief I had. I was going through a lot of her effects after after our father passed away, and I found that publication. It gave me such relief because I know she had really, she was a real artist, and she worked very hard at her poetry and submitted, as we do, multiple times. But she did have a publication in the Cumberland Review, in the same issue as Rita Kavazarani. I don't know if you knew her. But our mother's having these wonderful experiences in the classroom, these life-altering experiences in the classroom with these greats. It's a great parallel in our books.
So I'm going to go next sort of into something that could be a Langston Hughes story. I have a couple of little sections. My parents were in Jersey City in an interracial inner city parish, kind of a mission parish. And then in 1957, by then there were 7 children, and we moved to Indianapolis. And my mother, it was a huge house, the deanery, because my father became dean of the cathedral. And she had to make arrangements for a kind of help in the house that she'd never, a kind of formal help in the house that was never what she'd done before. More family residence, maid speaking, was how Mrs. Pendleton answered the phone. My mother, overhearing, nearly choked, explained immediately to Mrs. Pendleton that she should please feel free to say just hello or her name. My mother was not used to help who so overtly considered themselves servants. It occurs to me now that Mrs. Pendleton might have wanted to conceal her own identity. She was a minister's wife, my mother wrote Pam, her dear friend. They had that in common, and as they worked side by side, they talked freely on the subject. They also talked about race. She, Mrs. Pendleton, was quite amazed that we really feel the way we do, and has about 1,000 Langston Hughes type stories, like the short stories she read us from his book, The Ways of the White Folks, which always made her voice break and me cry. Nonetheless, here she was, Jenny Moore, with a wall-to-wall carpeting and a cook who couldn't seem to stop answering the phone, maid speaking. And not only that, when she, Jenny, drove along Washington Boulevard at the end of the day, she was forced to take in what it looked like she was part of, what she was part of now. All the maids in their uniforms standing on clipped green lawns, waiting for the Loop bus, an institution of the Black community that every day circled the white neighborhoods to take the women home. When she next wrote Pam, she had hired a person for Sundays, so I don't have to take the baby for church. Such luxury. She expressed her uneasiness about the help she now needed, the usual guilt about the privilege not only of being able to afford her, but of never having to think of money. There was, it seemed, no escape from the contradictions. A woman at the coffee hour after my father's installation as dean took her aside. "I hope you have a servant. Colored help is so cheap here." She was horrified at the remark, but she did need the help. "The house was really wonderful," she wrote, but it was also, as her predecessor remarked, a woman killer.
Mm.
Mm.
All right. Let me try to come back with.
Oh,
You want to go ahead?
I had that other one about John Allardyce. Should I do that after you?
However you like. Want to do that now?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. This is another element of the Indianapolis experience. What I didn't know then, and what research tells me now, is that the racial attitudes that shocked me were carried forward from a time when 3 out of every 4 white men in Indiana were Klan members. The Ku Klux Klan had been revived in Indiana in 1913. When I was at Shortridge High School, the Black neighborhood uptown of Monument Circle was spreading north. White flight was in full force as white families moved north and east to the districts of Broad Ripple, which was exclusively white, and to North Central and suburban Washington Township, where Negro students were fewer than 1 in 10. By the time I graduated, Negro students made up 60% of Shortridge student body. In 1968, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, a peaceful protest led to violence, and in 1981, a movement to make Shortridge a magnet academic high school failed and the school closed. I would not have imagined that outcome, so idealistic was I about Shortridge, despite the evidence of race division that faced me every day. Negro students sat on one side of the cafeteria at lunch, and I joined my white friends on the other side. My urge to be popular greater, apparently, than my social conscience. It was not until the end of my sophomore year that John Allardyce, the rising junior class president, gathered a group of both Black and white classmates at his parents' house just blocks from ours. There, we began carefully to talk about our experience of race at the school. John's election was an affirmation that the new attitudes of the 1960s were reaching into our lives. Popular, a straight-A student, blonde and hilarious, he had taken a stand, replying to a question at a Human Rights Club panel at the auditorium. If I fell in love with a Negro woman, I would marry her. This was the summer of the Freedom Riders, Blacks and whites riding buses together across the South in defiance of segregation laws. As word spread about John's leadership, about the radical fact of students of both races talking to each other, a cross was burned in his family's front yard.
Uncomfortably current.
Yeah, really. That was not what we thought was going to happen. No.
Okay, well, we'll get to that. I want to read from a piece from my book called Skin, an essay in my book called Skin. I can't help it, or so it appears. I carry the trove of my mother's stories inside of me, like an organ. I adorn myself with them, like jewels or thorns on a crown. Stories of her rage, pain, and bewilderment over what she had witnessed and experienced as a Black girl growing up in the Jim Crow South. Because she was a skilled narrator, I felt my mother's stories as much as heard them. Now I tell them myself because they are interesting, because I can't resist stories that can be felt as well as heard, and because I feel a need, both obligation and urge, to keep them alive. My mother felt the same need. The stories did not belong to her exclusively. Some of them she had inherited from her mother and grandmother, just as plainly as she had inherited from them the shape of her legs and the moles on her neck. My mother's family had no money. Their name was inherited from a white man. Am I maintaining our only legacy, or am I perpetuating the pain of the past? Is it telling the salve or the wound? It's strange to me, I say to Shantae, a friend and former student who was visiting from New York. The girls don't approach white people with the same wariness, even fear, that I do. That's because they're growing up in a house with a white person who loves them, Shantae replies. I know that when the girls go out with John, my husband, they're going to come back, I say to Shantae, who nods. She knows that I'm talking about the killings of Black men and women that now seem routine, the parade of deaths that feed the news at a steady march. I mean that the girls are going to come back alive, and that this is because of the color of John's skin. I should add that my husband is white. To read one more little piece. At a bed and breakfast in Hampton, Virginia, I become friendly with Barbara, the proprietor, a Black woman and a native Virginian. She gives me visitor's guides and advice on tourist attractions until I finally confess that I have come almost slowly to be among Black people, to see dark skin. And for this pleasure, I don't need to see anything or go anywhere but up and down the city streets. She nods, accepts my confession, but cannot fully empathize. She lives and works among Black people, so how could she? Before I arrived, I had imagined I would keep to myself during my visit to Hampton, which I had planned as a brief respite for my roles as wife and mother. Instead, I spend my time telling stories about my family to whoever will listen. Barbara is a good listener. After breakfast, she sits down with me at the table while I linger over coffee. She is still in her apron, her body turned toward me, one arm on the table, the other draped over her chair, her whole self a sign of reception. I tell her what I said to Shantae. White parents teach their children how to live, she says. We have to teach our children how to survive.
This legacy, you know, I was remembering today, the morning after Obama was elected, I was crossing the street out in front of my apartment, and this Black man was coming toward me, a sort of young guy, probably a Columbia student, because I live near Columbia. And we looked at each other and smiled, and he said, "It will be better now." And I thought of that this morning. I thought, well, some things are better and some things are way worse, or is it that the lid has been pulled off or this horrible time?
I remember actually during the election, I was actually in New Haven that year, and I was flying down the staircase at one of the buildings at Yale, and there's a white man who opened the door, but when he saw me, he was leading a group of surveyors or something around the campus. He let the door slam in my face when he saw me. But I thought, I thought to myself, I said, if this is a cost, I'll pay it. If this is the price, I will pay it gladly. And I remember walking the streets too and feeling like people were looking at each other. But then I thought, maybe I'm looking at people differently. Maybe it's not just that, it felt almost like a national depression had lifted. And
Yes.
whenever we get out of this regime, I wonder what that will feel like. Because I know that so many of us have been every day for the last several years, just holding our breath.
Well, what I began to think when I thought about that morning, I as I went through my day, I remember thinking that reading stuff in the newspapers and so on, people, it's something that is painful to so many American people of all races. And it seems so difficult to figure out our way out of it. And it was one reason that writing this book, I mean, I knew that race was a big theme in my mother's life. I mean, it was sort of the crux of her political awakening and her social justice awakening. She probably never met a Black person when she was a child. She probably never met more than one Black person until she was in that class that I read about. And so I think of it as this sad thing. And I guess that it was scary to write about race, but I did once have a very close, now dead, Black friend who said white people have to write about race. Mm-hmm. It's not only for Black people or people of color to write about. And when I saw, that you'd written this book, Stories from My Grandmother's Time, My Mother's Time, and Mine, I was like, I've got to talk to Emily again. You know, I've got to find her again.
It makes a huge difference. I mean, I don't know if other readers feel this way, but certainly when I'm reading a book by a white writer and they identify, you know, a character as white, just that simple act makes me know something about them. Makes me know that they are attentive and that they're thoughtful and that they're casting, I mean, in terms of that they're actually looking for me in the audience somewhere, you know, to signal, you know, this book is not just for people who, you know, they are casting a wide net in terms of readers and they're aware of a large readership. And it's a simple thing, but it's a profound thing. It is. And I say that, you know, it's unfortunate that in 2020 we're saying that, but for a white writer to name race is uncommon. I mean, you and I know
it is uncommon, and it's hard to do. It's a hard I don't know why it's a hard transition to make. I guess I have felt a lot of, I mean, I thought, duh, you know, but I thought I was scared. I mean, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I was supposed to do that. And it really took this era and me writing this book to understand that it was really a gesture of connection. And that also the other thing was that I grew up with the white, you know, all those horrible radical white fascist organizations, and I didn't want to identify as white, you know. But on the other hand, it's important to identify as white when one doesn't share those attitudes and when one is, you know, struggling to emerge out of this racist culture. I mean, it's like an illness one is continually trying to recover from, trying to move out of.
Yeah, and that's why I like so much that piece in your book when you know, the students are meeting or you're talking about race, because I would have loved to listen to those conversations, for you to come together and name this thing that you're both living with your bodies. But okay, here we are, and here's a story. What, you know, how do our stories intersect as white and Black students together? That is remarkable to me.
Well, it was very, this John Allardyce was, he still is quite a remarkable person. And I remember the feeling. I remember we were sitting in their living room, and it was John and a few of us, and then a few of the Black students, Obie McKenzie, who was a football player and basketball player, and Francina Satterfield, whom John Allardyce eventually took to the junior prom, another gesture of revolution. And we were aware, we didn't really have, the only context we had was sort of the civil rights movement. We didn't have all the kind of architecture of intellectual thought that we have now, you know, of all the work that's been done since the 1970s on race. But thinking back, it was an event. We were careful, we were frightened, and we were full of love. I mean, we were full of love that we hadn't been able to express.
Yeah. There's a lot of fear, I think, you know. I had the experience, I've forgotten to tell you this, but you know, I did a reading in Nashville. My first book first came out, and a lot of my high school friends and acquaintances, people I hadn't thought about, heard from in you know 2 decades, came, and we had the most powerful conversation just in a few minutes in the Q&A about what you are writing about, naming this, you know, what does it mean to you have an experience, and then finding a common vocabulary. Because I know for me, like for you, there are things that are happening, things you're witnessing in your home, and there's no sort of language for it. And then you develop the language, and then the language comes to you, or you find it, and then the story takes shape in a different way. Suddenly it falls into place. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes, you understand what part of the story is. I mean, you understand that, I mean, there's a story later in the book. My mother had a close friendship. It wasn't an affair, but it was a kind of romantic friendship with a Black man. And she went with him, they went to have a drink at the Carlisle Hotel. And they were both, my mother's marriage was breaking up, and I think his relationship, and they were romantic friends. They went to the Carlisle to have a drink. And there were the very dowagers she had thought about, when she was in college. And this time they just moved their table. They just moved tables and went sort of further away so that they wouldn't be seen or recognized. Because at that point, my father was the Bishop of New York, and he was, anti-racist, and it was just like way too much. But it's just a change. And, she was what, 20 when this happened, and now she's like 48. And so it's 30 years, and, big change has taken place. Yeah. Tell me more about what you said when you said you went to Hampton, and it wasn't so much that the sights you wanted to see as you wanted to just be among Black people.
Yeah. I mean, it's really, it's one of these, to just be able to be anonymous, and the liberty of that, something I don't take for granted. I live here, and I love my life in Vermont, but it's just the reality. I walk into many places and it's surprise, and that's
Right.
just the way it is. So I think, for me, my husband, we call it, I tell him my tank is empty. I have to go to fill my tank, and, back the plague hit, I'd go to see my brothers or go to Brooklyn and, have my little places to go. But something just so refreshing about being able to just walk and wander in the street and not have to sort of be self-conscious about, how someone might receive you. I saw this, I posted on my Facebook, Sterling Brown, the actor Sterling Brown, talking about how to manage his physical self, and his mother taught him that, here's how you enter the world. You are just you. You are just charming Sterling Brown, but the world receives you in this way. So be prepared for that gap. The experience of yourself, the experience the other people experience yourself, to not have to do that, to not have to prepare, to walk and just be received as an anonymous person is a strange freedom that, that I don't take for granted here.
Well, and you don't have, Vermont is very white, right?
Yes.
I remember I had a student at Iowa, Prairie Lights, an undergraduate student, and I had asked them all to write an essay about place. And he said, well, I just have a poem. This Black student of mine, he was like, I think he was one of 2 Black students in the class. And he said, got to Iowa, went to bed late at night, woke up in the morning, and everyone was white. I'm probably not, it's probably better verse than that, but I was so interested. Tell the story of how you actually, or maybe read the story of how you actually came across your mother's poems.
Oh, I'd love to. And that's just, I love that delicious coincidence, in our work, because we both you were working with and against this narrative. And when I discovered my mother's work, it changed me as a writer. It really it gave me a sense of purpose as a writer. And I'd love to read a couple of pages about that.
Please do. Yeah.
So it's from the epilogue, which I'm calling My Turn. A few years after my mother died, I discovered a cache of papers she left in my childhood bedroom closet. She buried them in an act of elegant and amusing symbolism underneath a pile of my father's long forgotten wrinkled shirts. The papers consisted mainly of poems, drafts and drafts of them, but there were a few essays. I hadn't known she wrote essays. One of them is an autobiographical narrative about her life as a child in the Jim Crow South. It's called My Turn. When my mother was a child, she often accompanied her beloved grandmother, Mama Timpy, to a local grocery store. In order to get to the store, they had to walk past rental houses owned by a lumber company. One day, some white boys threw rocks at the 2 of them. A pleasant stroll turned into a nightmare, my mother wrote. Mama Timpy, who practiced the kind of Black stoicism that has served as a guiding principle for African Americans since the inception of African presence in this country, walked on without evincing any emotion while the white boys jeered and pelted them with stones. When my mother asked Mama Timpy why they were being treated that way, her grandmother told her that the boys didn't know any better and should be pitied instead of hated. My mother idolized Mama Timpy. She accepted her grandmother's reasoning, and as an adult went on to practice the same kind of forbearance that made Mama Timpy the embodiment of strength and moral fortitude in the poetry my mother wrote. But the rock still wounded. She wrestled with the wounds in my turn. Her grandmother's keen analysis of the nature of racism, that it was a consequence of ignorance, did not stem the blow of blood that ran down her leg. After reading the story, I knelt on the floor, my heart racing. I reached the final lines and then started all over again. I was looking frantically for something. What was it? I didn't know, but I kept scanning the lines over and over, my throat tight and my breath short. There was something I needed that I didn't see. What is it? I kept asking myself as I read the paragraphs again and again, and then searched through her other papers, looking and looking. For what? Some words to correct the abomination of the rocks and my mother's bloody leg. And then I realized that what I was looking for was a salve, an answer, the end. For while the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we may triumph is never new, it must always be heard. There isn't any other tale to tell. It's the only light we've got in all this darkness. James Baldwin explains. It took me a while. It took the journey of this entire book, but I realized that there was a lesson, which was, in every scar there is a story. The salve is a telling itself.
Wow.
That was a real moment that we have.
Wow. And there you were on the floor of your childhood bedroom. I'm just, my mother, left me these cartons, and I hadn't really started to be a writer yet. But I love how how you make clear that finding this essay and these poems made you a different kind of writer. I wonder, maybe you could go into that a little bit more.
Well, I think, I think there's also something so profound. There's a book that's out. I think I saw an ad for it. Someone's collected writers thinking about their mothers before they were mothers. And and that beautiful piece that was produced, in honor of this day and your book, when we encounter and understand our parents as people, and I think as women to understand our mothers as human beings.
Yeah.
For me, I found all this material at once. So I saw the dress and I saw this mind at work, and I saw how my mother was wrestling down experience, and taking the most painful moments in her life and wringing them and making music out of them. And it's the blues practice, of taking that jagged edge of life and making meaning out of it. So I saw it unfolding in front of me, this profound testament, from beyond the grave. And I saw her taking this moment and wrestling with it. And I saw the labor involved, and I saw the sheer effort involved to make it mean something. And that was what I learned that night, that there's no glossing over, there's only the encounter and what we bring to the encounter. There's no kind of tidy, and it was never something my mother was someone who, and it's in her work, I can look at her and be reminded, she took life head on. She took it all head on, and she worked it out in her poetry. All of her faith in God, and she wrote about nature, she wrote about politics. The whole world she took and wrestled with it and engaged with it in this enduring way. And for me, it was humbling, because I saw how she was so hard at work, and I didn't even know it. She wasn't doing it to show off. She wasn't doing it,
Right.
For attention. She was doing it because that's what she did, because she was a poet. That's what poets do. They work on line breaks, and that's what she
Mm.
was doing. And it was just such evidence, to the end, this woman, this mother was encountering her life and everything on the page, all by herself. And, every time I feel that laziness coming on, I think about my mother alone, at work, and with no promise of publication, with no, none of that stuff. It was just really my mother and the work. And it's just, that's the finish line. That's the goal.
What was her name, Emily?
My mother's name was Clara Jean Jefferson, and then she became Bernard. So Clara Jean Jefferson. Oh, Clara
So
Jean.
the poet was Clara Jean Jefferson.
The poet. Well, my mother had a nom de plume, and we never got her to confess where it came from, and now I'll never know, because her sisters were too young to know. But her name was Neva Marks. Was her poet? Her nom de plume.
Spell that, Neela.
Marks. Neva Mark or Marks. I wish my brother could tell me.
Wow.
Neva and Mark. I think Neva Mark or Marks. I should know this. I think I always want to say Marks, but it's Mark.
Well, another thing for that visit I'm making to you in Vermont is to look at your mother's poems.
Can't wait. Please bring a truckload of your mother's stuff too. And just to be able, both of us we both love the archives, and to see again, all the scribblings, it's just such it is Christmas for every, here's a little scribbling. My father was a physician. So my mother, she would get all the, my mother worked with him, all the notepads from the pharmaceutical company. So there's a whole story, all of these pharmaceutical pads. My mother's, making these notes and the margins. I could see her at work filing one set of hands, and and the other side of her brain just kind of wondering. And that's just kind of a thrill.
Well, my mother, unbelievably to me, she read The Feminine Mystique when it came out in 1963. In 1964, they moved to Washington. And with 9 children, she managed to go over to a neighbor's empty house every morning for 3 hours. So this is early 1964. And the book came out in 1968, September 1968. Here is her difficulty in finding an ending. And it speaks to what you're saying about wrestling on the page. But she was it was a memoir. It's called The People on Second Street, a memoir of her time in Jersey City. But she was hogtied about an ending. It had been a decade since they left Grace Church. And now at the end of 1967, the optimism of the early civil rights movement seemed in ruins. Race riots had raged for days in Newark and Detroit, and President Johnson had dispatched 4,700 Army paratroopers to assist the National Guard. She understood that poverty, as well as race, was an issue, and she was wary of rhetoric that claimed substantive improvement in the lives of the American poor. She had been in their houses. There might be more jobs, more amenities like telephones and better plumbing, she wrote, but the hard, unavailable fact remains that the people on Second Street live outside that world that becomes more affluent at every turn. They are still politically powerless, groggy from television, television's half-truths, patronized by handouts from a grossly inefficient welfare system. We had changed none of that, she wrote, but we became part of the community. We weren't there to work the block, then leave after 2 years. Primarily, and leaving aside psychological motives from our own backgrounds, we lived on Second Street because we believed in God and the unique worth of every person. We believed in God, which I take to mean a belief in some power beyond individual human effort. The unique work of every person is a phrase more typical of my mother. But while she may have crystallized her thinking, she still did not have an ending for the story her book told. The people on Second Street recounted and reflected on a time in the past, but what they had learned in Jersey City continued to resonate. How do you write an ending to something that is still changing your life? As so often happens to writers, her need summoned a chance event. No one was home. My father was at the cathedral, the children out playing, when there came a knock on the door. Though he was now a grown man, not the little boy she'd known in Jersey City, she remembered him clearly from Christmases, from hot summers, from scrawled letters. Dear friends, I like this fresh air camp. He was a regular in kitchen table conversations about being Black. And she remembered seeing him shining shoes outside the Hudson Tube Station. That's now the Path. We talked the whole long afternoon. He was still in Jersey City, though he had gone to college for 2 years. Now 27, married, and the father of 2, he was holding down 2 jobs. We talked of all the friends we both remembered, of their lives, the poverty, the rats, the housing, of his father's drinking, of how it had felt to be a Negro over the years since we had known each other so well. Was it a question, she asked, that prompted what came next? Before you came, we had very little hope, he was suddenly saying. You started a chain of things. There was camp and different experiences like that. And when there was nothing else to do, we could just go to Grace Church and hang around. You were the first white people we didn't hate. There was love and care for a long time. He hesitated before getting up to leave. I must have looked startled because he touched my arm as we sat on the sofa and went on to explain. You're too hard on yourself. You mean you didn't know people remember the love? Anyone could tell you. Even the guys who don't give a damn about God will admit that when you pin them down. She had her ending, but she must have known how quickly such a moment passes, because she closed the book with a date, Washington, D.C., 1967. She didn't know that time itself was changing. I just love that feeling of not knowing how to end a book, and then some kind of chance things turns up.
How did your mother feel about your writing?
Well, she died before my first publication. I mean, I'd had a poem accepted by Richard Howard for the American Review, and it was the lead poem in the issue, which I didn't know it then, but she said, that Howard thing is very important. You know, that's a big deal. Congratulations, so wonderful. But what I found out with her papers was that she wrote poems as a child and as a girl. And, you know, so she, even though her poems are from the age of 14, which I didn't know then, she knew what a poem was. And she was very proud of me. And she kept repeating it. But of course, I don't know, we don't pay attention enough when they're alive to what they say to us.
We don't. It's true. Should we open up to questions?
Yeah, but I just want to say, would you be open to putting together a small book of your mother's poems?
You know what, let me tell you something. My brother actually did this. My older brother did this.
Oh, he did that.
It's beautiful. I actually have the book, and that's another beautiful memory, is that he and a friend did that, and they gave it to my mother, and it meant a huge amount to her. They made this beautiful book with gorgeous paper and lovely binding, but absolutely. I mean, I've got them all, and sort of trying to figure out how they should keep living, because you know. That's
well, we can talk about that.
Absolutely.
But yes, open to questions.
Okay.
All right, hi, sorry. So we have one question already so far, but for everyone else who's watching, now's a great time to type a question into the Q&A field, and we'll just read them aloud now. So the first question comes from Victoria. She says, I am filled with longing hearing both Emily and Honor read from the interior lives of their mothers. For those of us who don't have writings from our mothers, how can we recover our mother's interior life? Bless you both, and bless your mothers, as they must be smiling and shining from the other side.
That's so lovely. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I'm wondering if there are letters lying around, or scrapbooks. I mean, part of what women have done with narrative is to write letters and to keep scrapbooks. I mean, I was wondering what happened to my mother's writing between, 1944 and 1964. Well, it was letters and it was scrapbooks. Right?
Yeah, same thing. My mother actually kept, I'm grateful for my mother's, they kept every piece of paper. So there are greeting cards and so many opportunities to imagine and fill in gaps. Just, and you're right, there's the way the photographs are organized. And I feel very fortunate that I had, you're right, but correspondence is a place I think we find a lot for our mothers, telling the stories of their lives, organizing them.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question comes from Tiffany. Emily, can you please explain the tie between your family, mother, and I think as poet laureate, I only caught a part of it.
Yes, my mother was the protege of Robert Hayden's, who was the first African-American poet laureate. He taught at Fisk University. My mother was a student there. And he would take my mother with him when he would read and say to audiences, folks, we're watching the kettle boil. And actually, one of my great sadnesses is that she could not find later in her life the correspondence that they had exchanged, because I think Hayden had hoped my mother would continue to write poetry, and they lost touch. And then sometime in her marriage, she took up writing with him again. And I remember within the last 10 years before she died, she was looking for these letters. I keep hoping there's somewhere, tucked into something.
Well, look in the Robert Hayden papers for her letters.
That's a great idea.
I found, to my surprise, Dorothy Day, the activist, was a friend of my mother's, and I actually found some of her letters, my mother's letters, in Dorothy Day's papers.
What a great idea. We'll look for that.
Yeah, do. Yeah.
Awesome. Next question comes from Marion. What was it like to read each other's books? Did you have an experience of comparing their lives as you read?
We did.
Go ahead, Emily.
Well, we did very much. I was surprised. Again, I was surprised. I shouldn't be, but our mothers grew up, in different countries, effectively. My mother in the Georgia South, your mother is in the Boston Bronx, having this American life. They never would have met. But they're, as literary women with ambitions, who are interested in the world, and who chafed at the constraints of, of what they had inherited, the social world, and also women who were favored, in some way, right? They were favored. Yeah. My mother was favored by her father, which was a stroke of luck, because he invested a lot in her because she was his firstborn. And so they enjoyed the favor of powerful men, and they I identified with Honor's mother at certain moments when she's sort of thinking about there's the differences, but also the similarities and the experiences of these women were stunning to me.
You were saying when my mother was trying to decide whether to get married or not, you identified
how to be a wife, how to get married and be a wife, and this kind of fantasy of being a wife, and I thought about my own mother, and and how they chose their mates and told those stories later.
Yeah,
really wonderful.
Well, I asked my mother after her accident, which preceded her death by 2 or 3 years. I asked her. I said, she asked me. No, she said, "Are you going to have children?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." She said, "You'd be crazy to have children. You love your independence too much." Okay. And you don't know how those declarations are going to affect you. I haven't had children. Was it because she said that to me? I don't know. But it's like, did your mother encourage your writing? She must have been so proud of you.
Oh yeah, my mother was, she did. My mother was I learned to take criticism because of my mother. She encouraged my writing, she criticized my writing. She would she would tell me when it wasn't good. I mean, and that was
Wow.
I mean, at a very young age, I was being told, not, oh, how sweet, dear. I was being told that metaphor is insufficient. You know, it doesn't capture, so I was going back to the drawing. I learned early on that writing is rewriting and taking a kick in the pants sometimes when you are not working hard enough. So
Wow.
she did. I mean, and of course I didn't realize how important that lesson, until much later. I learned how to take a no.
But you
Yeah.
got to have your mother until 2008. So you got to have her into your 40s, into your,
Yes,
yeah.
I did. I got to have her, and I got to have those. I mean, still, I wish I had. And I'm very lucky now to have. My mother has three sisters, and I'm lucky now to be able to ask those questions. But that's the thing. I always tell younger people, to get that tape recorder out and ask those
Yeah.
questions.
I tell my students that.
Yeah.
Pay attention.
Pay attention.
Okay, thanks. The next question comes from James, who says, I was fascinated by the term racial gaps. Do you find that we are developing a whole new set of gaps because of our current political situation?
I mean, I think the gaps, I think you're right. I mean, I think the gaps exist and we're seeing them. I hope we remember. I mean, we're great in this country at forgetting things we don't want to face. So we are facing the inequities that exist and have never not existed. I think that's what the virus is revealing. But absolutely. What about you? What do you think, Honor?
Well, I continue to think that the gaps are tragic to our country, and I continue to long for communication. And I have found, with having increasingly diverse groups of students who are, increasingly different from each other and from me, that I learn so much. And I love that. I love learning about human nature. I love being more solidified in my critique of this country. And I love being able to understand what racism has done to me spiritually and morally, and in terms of losses or my fear of going further in friendships with people of color whom I've loved but been afraid of. So I so value our talking.
The next question is for Honor, and it comes from R. Gordon. The question is, it's Honor, I love the way you analyze family photographs for memories and meaning. Did that skill come from your mother?
My mother would say things like, look at that picture. But it actually came from my poetry, the poetry part of me. I seem to, it started with the poetry part of me, and then when I wrote about my mother's mother, and I like didn't meet her mother, who had, died in 1926, I would, or not 26, well, 34 or something. But anyway, I would look at these pictures and I would try to get a sense of these people. So it really came from that. It came from, and then I would like write a photograph, and I would, write it. Then Maggie Anderson, the poet Maggie Anderson, has an exercise in which you write a photograph from one point of view, and then you write it from a second person, or you write it from someone outside the photograph, someone looking at the photograph, someone who's present when the photograph is taken but not there, and you start to have a lot of interesting approaches to photographs.
Yeah, cool, thanks. The next question is from Roz for Emily. Emily, how has your mother's writings influenced your writing?
Hi, Roz. My friend in Vermont, my dear friend. My mother's writing, I am a writer because of my mother. And I think that has to do with whatever mysteries of you know, genetics. But also just really idolizing her, you know, when growing up, I'm wanting to be like her. But I think also because my mother was someone who deeply believed in the power of story, you know, as a way to survive. You know, she read like it was her job, you know. I mean, she read all the time, and there was no real distinction for my mother between life and story. And she revered, you know, good writing, but she also understood how necessary it was. It wasn't something outside of her reach. It was something, it was a conversation that she was part of. We listened to books on the radio. We read books together. When I was in college, she read books on my syllabus. You know, she grew up at a time when, you know, even at HBUs, even at Fisk University, it wasn't, you know, people weren't teaching African American literature. So I actually, you know, here she was at Fisk with everyone, you know, with Robert Hayden and others, and everyone passing through, but it wasn't an organized course of study. And so when I went away to college, and then she was reading alongside, you know, we read together. So we had that funny overlap where I was reading there. I introduced her to Their Eyes Watching God, you know, and
Wow.
yeah, and she had kind of come up with these stories and knowing about Hurston from a different angle. So, you know, from a personal angle, you know, she didn't know Zora Neale Hurston, but she, you know, kind of was part of that story about the South that Hurston was telling. So I think, you know, for me, I think writing is about remaining close to my mother in some ways. And I know that the next two books that I'm working on are very much, there's an urgency I feel to just, you know, remembering her and remembering those lessons, especially as my daughters get older. I think that's also shaped me as a writer too, just understanding this is it. I mean, I guess I'm never going to grow out of this, you know, this belief.
As it turns out, right?
As it turns out, this was it. Books, the end and the beginning. And so I think for me, you know, my mother always thought it was just essential the way that she lived. So it's something she taught me as much as she taught me any other lesson, you know, how essential story was.
My mother too was a great reader, and what we read together, because she died in 73, at 50, we did read Ms. Magazine together.
Huh.
She would call me and she'd say, have you read that piece called Combat in the Erogenous Zone? I said, yes. She said, I think it's just amazing. I don't know where she gets the courage to do that. The famous book by Ingrid Benjes.
And did you read, she read that, there's a moment in your book when she reads The Feminine Mystique.
Yes.
I forget, did you read it too? Did you read it with her? What was your relationship with that book?
I didn't read it until later.
Yeah.
I just knew what it had meant to her.
Yeah.
I did read The Second Sex while she was still alive, and we talked we were talking about feminism, because she was becoming an independent woman. She was becoming a single woman. She was doing what you wouldn't, you know, the bishop's wife was leaving the bishop.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, the next question is from Major Jackson. He says, the discoveries of your mother's inner lives is startling in your books. Were there moments that were uncomfortable to write given the proximity to their interiority?
Uncomfortable. I would say uncomfortable in that I wanted to get it right, not uncomfortable because of the intimacy of them, because no matter how self-disclosing my mother was, she was never going to be as self-disclosing as this girl who came up in consciousness raising and the sexual revolution. She just wasn't. I mean, at least not by 1973. So the discomfort was, am I going to get it right? Am I going to find her saying or writing the thing that gets her from point A to point B? You know, the moment when she says, I was always a we, and now I am I. And it was like, oh, she did know what she was doing. I guess the discomfort was how to be both disclosing and discreet, and to somehow honor her values while also pushing the envelope and telling the true story of a woman like this. And I got a great gift. I mean, the book, you'll see when you read it, is like there's much of her language intertwined in it. Not only her fiction and her poems, but also her letters and diaries and jottings. And so I do have something she wrote about. I got her permission that way.
And so what a sacred gift to give.
Mm.
Here is my life. Take care. I mean, that is extraordinary to me. And I feel the same. I didn't get the explicit mandate, but I feel my mother left, you know, she could have destroyed, obviously, the paper she left behind. But I feel the same thing that you feel, just that the real need, there's a need to get it exactly right. But also we have to be who we are as writers. You know, we're not our mothers, and we do, you know, we do tell stories differently. And like my mother, like what you said, that dynamic, you know, between disclosure and discretion.
Right. Yes.
And I like that a lot, because sometimes the most, you know, dramatic stories have to be told with a little bit of restraint, in order to make them, you know, vivid. So
in order to make them, yeah.
Because our mothers left behind these extraordinary lives. I mean, they're extraordinary turbulence they experience in their own lives. So how to treat that fairly and attend to their unique lives, but also both of us, you know, our mothers, we see them as part of a moment. You know,
What year was your mother born?
1938.
So 15 years after my mother.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay, the next question comes from Bev, and it's for Emily. What kind of mother might you be in a browner or blacker community? What do you imagine would be the same or different?
Hi, Bev. I think that's my friend Beverly. Happy Mother's Day. What a great question. I have the same question for you. My friend Beverly lives in Vermont. How would I be? I think that, you know, that's an interesting question. It's hard to imagine, you know, the counterfactual, as they say in the law, what that would be, what that would be to, what that would mean. I mean, I think that, you know, to live in this country as a Black mother of Black daughters, to live in this world, you know. So I don't imagine that there would be a state really where I would have to. I mean, you know, we all dream of freedom. We all dream of freedom, you know. And those of us who feel the straitjackets, you know, and who have to don the various masks we don, we dream of freedom. So what would it mean to be free? I don't know. I don't know that there's a state where, as a Black woman, I could be absolutely free and raise my children as pure human beings. We all would love that. So I feel that the tools that, you know, that it's my obligation to make sure my children are outfitted with the right tools to live in Vermont are the same ones they would have to have anywhere in this country. You know, they're citizens because of the internet. I mean, they really are citizens of the world, you know. And I think that the question is, you know, how do we, as parents, you know, are parents of children of color, parents of children at all, and girls too. We teach our kids that the world is a good place. We want them to have faith in the world, you know, but we want them to be prepared. We want them to live. We want them to survive, and we want them to not be hurt. But then sometimes I think about the immortal words of James Baldwin in his play. I think it's a play, The Welcome Table. You know, sometimes it's neck-breaking time. So we, you know, we want to protect our children from harm, but sometimes, you know, it's time to fight. And our kids have to make that decision themselves when it's time to just encounter the world. I mean, if I had it my way, I would keep my kids in my pockets all day long. But you know, I think but we can't do that. We have to let them experience the world and get burned. So I don't have a neat answer to that, because if there were a country where I could live freely, I would be there. But instead, I'll just stay in my little box here.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Catherine. Who are the foremothers of your writing lives?
Oh my goodness. My mother, Adrienne Rich, Sonia Sanchez, Muriel Ruckhiser, Virginia Woolf. How's that for a list?
Oh, it's a great list. Well, I think for me, most definitely Zora Neale Hurston. You know, as a person, as an artist, as a woman in a man's game in the Harlem Renaissance, as someone who cared about memory and preserving the lives of her people. She's certainly someone I admire and I study. I would go as far back as to Harry Jacobs, who wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. I mean, that book is so instructive. Talk about discretion and declaration, you know, what she was trying to do as a woman who, you know, had children and had to explain to a Victorian audience what she was doing with these children and defend herself and her integrity and dared write about romance, you know, and worked to become a writer as she was a mother, and that cost was always something she was negotiating and working in a hostile literary establishment. Frances Harper, who wrote a book in 1892 that I love. So for me, a lot of those 19th century writers, because they were carving out the path. I mean, they were establishing a tradition, and they were negotiating, you know, the demands of gender. I mean, they were part of the women's movement, but they were not. Yes. And they were supporting Black male writers, and they were trying to make room for themselves and trying to establish a tradition for newly freed people. So I go back to these writers a lot for instruction. And of course, I mean, we all are sit at the knee of Toni Morrison, you know, and how she gave us an American vernacular, really. I mean, our language, try to talk about the original American trauma of slavery. Let's see. I mean, there's so many. I mean, I think for me,
and is Baldwin? So I realized I left him off my list.
Yeah. I think he's our foremothers, but yeah, certainly Baldwin, the writer who, you know, shaped. I mean, he took the pulpit and he made it his. Yeah. And I think for me, so many of them, you know, I'm aware all the time of those women who, you know, as in There I Was Watching God, the main character's grandmother, who told her, I wanted to preach a sermon about a colored woman sitting on high, but there was no pulpit for me. I think about those women who no one cared what they thought about anything, you know, and maybe they couldn't write, but they had stories, you know, and they had lessons, and I'm always listening for their voices in the shadows, you know, of documented stories, you know, think about 12 Years a Slave and Patsy. The story's all about, but then Patsy says, well, what will become of me? You know, so and Patsy forgotten to the history, you know, there's no record of what happened to Patsy. And I write for Patsy. You know, I'm here because there's a pulpit for me, and I'm here to represent and remember those women.
Awesome, thank you. I think this is our last question. Tiffany asks, how did you two meet?
Well, well, I have a friend named Elizabeth Alexander, the poet and essayist. And years ago, 25 years ago or something, we would meet in New York. And she said, come to this bar on East something street. So I went to this bar and she said, I'll bring my friend Emily. So I went to meet her and her friend Emily, whom I describe as a skinny little thing, who was about to publish her first book, The Carl Van Vechten Letters. And we connected and we sort of stayed in touch. And then last summer on Martha's Vineyard, I heard her read at the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival, or maybe I came right at the end of her reading or something. I said, well, where's Emily Bernard? And she said, oh, she's over there, you know, signing books. And I went racing over, and I really didn't have any sense that she'd remember me. So I kind of tapped her on the shoulder and I said, Emily, it's an honor. And it was like, have I left anything out, Emily?
That's it. And then since then, we just remembered how much we just dig each other.
So we just decided, you know, I thought, who should I get to do a Prairie Lights event? You know, in this new freedom of the pandemic, you can say, okay, I'm going to do an event. Who should I do? Emily, can it be done? Iowa, Vermont, New York. Yes. And so.
Yeah. And our new chapter.
Our new chapter. And thank you all so much for
Yes.
coming. And Emily, thank you for saying yes.
Oh, thank you for asking me, Honor.
And Karen, thank you for putting up with all our anxiety and losing emails. And if Jan ever sees this, thank you, Jan, who owns Prairie Lights Bookstore and who is a friend. And anyway, much love and happy Mother's Day to all the mothers and all the different kinds of mothers, which I am, and which Emily is. So.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you, Prairie Lights. And thank you, Karen.
Bye. Thank you, Prairie Lights. Buy our books. Buy our books.
Yes. All right. We're selling books.
And the Body on sale at Prairie Lights. You can call or you can go online to place an order.
And I signed labels.
Yes. Our Revolution, we have custom signed labels as well. And we can ship the books, or we can do free local delivery in the Iowa City, Coralville area. So thank you guys so much. This was so lovely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.